wanted to start with you, Veronica. Are you able to just briefly give us a quick introduction about yourself? I know you're doing a lot of amazing work with the Critical Minerals Africa group. Can you also share with us the mandate of the company and the sort of support that you're providing to this very important critical minerals supply chain?
Yes, of course. Well, firstly, thank you for having me, Jacob, and it's a pleasure to meet you, Roshan, as well. So as you rightly say, I'm the founder and CEO of the Critical Minerals Africa Group. By way of background, I've been working in the Africa investment and trade and investment space for 20 years, predominantly looking at how to support governments package their foreign direct investment and attract investors. And then on the other side, working with corporate companies, looking for opportunities on the continent, looking for opportunities in terms of JVs, mergers and acquisitions, to supporting mid-sized businesses or SMEs capital raise. So I have a whole suite of experience working on the African continent, and I myself, my family come from East Africa, so I'm a proud African. I set up Critical Minerals Africa Group. Really, it was born of frustration. It was because I didn't see an adequate platform that spoke to Africa and critical minerals in this global supply chain. And to me, it made very little sense when you look at the fact that Africa has 30% of the world's critical minerals and rare earths. And it's vital that we are part of dialogue and conversation when it comes to supply chain. And especially when we know that Africa really needs to it's got a requirement in terms of its population projection to ensure that there are jobs in the coming years. And so what better way to do that than to look at how critical minerals can help accelerate economic growth and job creation. So setting up Critical Minerals Africa Group was an urgency, frankly. I saw that there was a gap between how government legislation was connecting with investment and investors. Having spent my career working with the investor community, I saw that there was a real lack of knowledge and understanding as to where the opportunities lay and what really the regulation and policy frameworks were for investors. And then having just concluded 4 years in Ghana, where I worked on policy for industrialization, I recognize that also governments need that assistance and support when looking at how to develop strategies that can help accelerate economic growth. So looking at how they use critical minerals as a way of enabling economic growth, essentially. So that's why we were set up to support those two sectors even. And really to help bridge the gap of knowledge between what government is issuing and what investors need to know, and just being an advocacy platform for Africa when it came to critical minerals.
Interesting. That's so nice to hear. And I know, Roshan, for you in your case, you are trying to address a specific gap, specifically to the lithium supply chain. In terms of what just Stardust Power is doing, is there anything that you would want to share in terms of what your customer value proposition is and the sort of gap that you're trying to address in this whole entire supply chain?
Yeah, happy to. But first of all, Jacob, thank you for having me today. It's great to be with you. Always wonderful to be with Rafiki Energy and Veronica. Wonderful meeting with you. Love the mission that you're doing. Unlocking the power of the African economy is so important, and anything we can do to be supportive. So at Stardust Power, we're really focused on the midstream processing side. What we see is that America is blessed with a lot of lithium brine resources, coupled with a very active oil and gas industry that's increasingly getting into lithium, as we've seen with Exxon and more recently Chevron. But the critical gap is not necessarily in raw material production, where we're drilling more lithium wells, we're advancing DLE, but it's on the processing side, taking a lithium chloride or other feedstock and manufacturing battery grade lithium carbonate. And this is where China really owns the value chain. They control up to 85% of global lithium refining capacity. So at Stardust Power, we're focused on that midstream processing. We're building a really large, centrally located lithium refinery in the heartland in Muskogee, Oklahoma, that at full capacity can produce up to 50,000 tons per annum. And one of the differentiators is that we're optimizing this large central refinery for multiple forms of lithium brine input, so we can aggregate supply and scale manufacturing up to that 50,000 tons. And we see this as a critical piece of the national energy infrastructure because it gives those upstream developers a home to sell their products. Smaller developers that might not have the assets to justify $1 billion capex investment into processing now can make their projects economically viable and send it here in the US. So we think we can help unlock the upstream supply chain as well by having this large central refinery.
Excellent. That's so nice to hear. And coming to you, Veronica, obviously one of the risks that has been identified in the market in terms of just slowing down the momentum that we've built in developing these critical mineral supply chains, it's geopolitics. I know when we hear that buzzword, a lot of things come to our minds, but I just wanted you to add a little bit of context to that. Is this really something that we should be worried about? How big is this risk?
I mean, look, geopolitics is what is shaping this space. And may I add as well that people are mistakenly looking at critical minerals as a sector. And I spend a lot of time sort of recorrecting a lot of the misperceptions about what critical minerals are. Critical minerals isn't a sector, it enables other sectors to grow. So you use it to catalyze industry, as was mentioned, automotive industry, upstream, downstream, etc. But it is not a sector in itself. And I think that's important to sort of understand from the offset. In terms of geopolitics, well, we've had on the continent a lot of interest in the mineral wealth that the continent possesses, from the likes of China, obviously well established on the continent, to most recently the US, securing essentially a minerals for security partnership in the DRC and with Rwanda. We've also seen a huge interest from Europe, and from India to Japan to South Korea. So I mean, there's a lot of interest in where those minerals are located and how partnerships can be formed. I should mention Saudi Arabia and the UAE are also very interested in the mineral wealth. So, it's a global interest essentially. And why is that something to, I guess it's on the radar. It can be seen as positive, it can be seen as negative, but in my view, I think it only increases the demand. And so it means that the demand increase should shape the way that the governments and the leadership within the continent looks at how they can develop these minerals to allow for value addition or to allow for beneficiation. And I think the interest only just accelerates and shows how powerful and what an important role Africa will play in the global supply chain. Now, there's a disconnect because one can also say that the geopolitics race for critical minerals is also meaning that there is a bit of a panic around how these minerals are going to be used. And it doesn't help that you have the word critical and rare in front of the word minerals, because I think that then just accelerates the panic even more. We stand for at CMAG, taking our time and looking very cautiously into the future and looking at a vision of 20 to 30 years down the line. Where will Africa be, and how can these minerals be used to ensure that there is going to be industrialization and there will be that job creation at the end of it, and really looking at kind of long-term solutions rather than just the old extractives curse. And that's what we don't want a repetition of. And I think geopolitics can often make it feel that we need to get rid of the minerals, sell it and move on to the next mineral, when in actual fact what we really need to be doing is thinking about how we're utilizing these minerals to accelerate our own industries. And so I see it as a benefit. I think if it's done correctly, it can certainly help the continent. My worry is that there is a lack of understanding as to how these minerals can be used, and also how to ensure that it is creating value in the continent as well as outside of it. there are lots of ways that governments can look at this positively and create plans and strategies around how they use these minerals, which I'm sure I'll be sharing later on. But ultimately, I see it as a force for good, so long as there is a unified kind of approach within the continent through our regional bodies, through the AFCFTA, for example, as to how we're going to approach developing our mineral wealth.
Yeah, that's very true, and I do agree with you. Looking at the research that I recently did, this whole entire situation, I think for me, it sort of like opened up the market. We're seeing a lot of players coming in and out, obviously because there's a lot of demand that has been built and enough supply that needs to be satisfied at the same time. And when I look at most of these players that are coming in, one of the things that caught my attention really is the failure rate. I think it's pretty high, especially on the capex side. Most of these companies that are trying to develop huge capital projects, for instance, like what Roshan and your team are trying to do, most of them are either blowing up their budget or failing to stay ahead of costs. Now, when I did look through the FAIL 3 report that you recently produced, Roshan, it's very clear that the way you've designed your process, I think, is so cost efficient. How are you achieving that?
Yeah, thank you for noticing. Upon our release of our FEL 3 results, we've decreased estimated capex by 200 million, a substantial number, increasing the efficiency of our project. And that process really starts from day one, efficiency from day one. Our facility is designed for that efficiency with linear layouts, modular system, pre-assembled structure. We cut complexity substantially, handling rework, which are some of the biggest hidden cost drivers. Also, by using proven and established technologies, we can limit our technology risk and the amount of resources that are put into R&D. Instead, we use proven off-the-shelf technology, which decrease that risk substantially. Also, repeatability as a cost hedge, standardized tank sizes, modular engineering, limiting bespoke engineering, proven design layouts, so we can cut our time on site by engineering modular portions off-site and shipping them to site. That increases health and safety, decreases risk, and decreases cost. Industry-wide cost mitigation, rising labor cost, inflation, and supply chain constraints are real. The solution is efficiency. So we've designed that into our system as much as possible. And Oklahoma as a jurisdiction is a very efficient jurisdiction as well. So we're able to limit our cost a lot that way as well.
Interesting. One other thing that I also did notice was I think you've received a lot of support from the Oklahoma governor in general and everyone else, which for me, I think speaks to the importance of what policy can do in just driving capital inflows, especially from the private sector. And I know for a fact that we cannot speak about developing sustainable critical mineral supply chains without focusing on the policy side. And based on what you're seeing in the market, Veronica, is policy really a key enabler that we should be focusing on in terms of just driving this critical minerals campaign that we're talking about? I think you're on mute.
Sorry. Absolutely. I would say it's one of the most important things to get right and to get right now. I think we need to insist on good policy frameworks. Now, I can draw on the example of having spent the last 4 years working closely with the Ghanaian government on how they were developing policy for industrialization. So looking at how to redraft policy for the automotive, pharmaceutical and textile and garment sectors. The automotive industry in Ghana in the 60s was one of the biggest hubs for automotive. It was state-owned and thriving. However, over the years, that decreased. I think essentially it dwindled, and opportunities arose in South Africa and Morocco, which today in Africa are the two biggest hubs for the automotive industry. So our policy work was really designed around understanding what potential auto manufacturers would be looking for if they were looking to move into the market, what they liked in other jurisdictions that perhaps they were not seeing in Ghana, and also, you know, what are some of the incentives that they would like to see. And I think over a period of 6 months, we surveyed about 500 companies. And as a result of that, we were then able to utilize a lot of that information to put that into a new policy. In a matter of 3 months, the policy was passed through cabinet. And then after that, we saw the first mover in the market was Volkswagen. And after Volkswagen, 14 others have now followed. So it's an excellent example of how, when you draft sound policy and incentive framework, investors will come. Ghana in 4 years has moved from 0 OEMs, so that's the auto manufacturers, to today 15. And largely many of the names that you'd have heard of, such as Peugeot, Nissan, Toyota, Kia, etc. So again, I think it's very easy for people to talk about attracting investment. Really, we can all do that. And we can entice investors in, but how do you keep them? That's the vital question. And the thing that makes them the longevity of an investor is to make sure that there's a sound governance framework, sound policy, and also sound incentives. And so with that, when you look at, when you look at the critical mineral space, it's really important that we look at how this policy will help shape industries, which is why I go back to what I earlier alluded to, which is we need to understand how these minerals are going to be used for industrialization, because really that's what Africa needs. And by the way, Africa's approach to critical minerals shouldn't be seen as a one size fits all, like we see minerals being used in the US markets, used in the Chinese markets, etc. It's actually very different for us on the continent. Why? A few things. One is that we have a lack of energy. So our baseload is still fledgling. And I think when thinking about moving up the value chain, thinking about beneficiation and value addition, we need to ensure that we have our rock bed of, you know, enough baseload to deal with manufacturing and processing. So the way that we develop critical minerals will need that foundation corrected, if you like. So that's number one. Number two is that we need infrastructure. If you're going to move minerals from mines out to ports, then you're going to need infrastructure that includes roads, and ports. So all of that development needs to be in place prior to you thinking about how you're utilizing these minerals. And lastly, it's water. You cannot have the breaking of rocks, for example, that very physical approach without using water. Water is vital. And so thinking about value addition, thinking about beneficiation of critical minerals, if you have that within your nation, but you have a real lack of water, then that's a problem. So it needs to have that kind of rock bed or that foundation before we start thinking about how we're developing these minerals. So that's the first thing. And then secondly, when we've talked about policy, we need to think about where the market lies. So currently we look at, you know, electric vehicles and the electric vehicle supply chain as being something that, you know, Africa should be ensuring that it has a place within the supply chain. And we know China has a lot of the supply chain for EV sewn up. It has the biggest market for electric vehicles, followed by the US market. And also, you know, they dominate when it comes to mineral processing, as I'm sure Roshan will be able to confirm. And I think if that's the case, then we need to start thinking about, well, what are the meaningful areas that Africa can get involved in within that EV supply chain? Is it that we need to look at maybe setting up sovereign wealth funds so that when those extraction of the minerals is happening, we're also putting money aside to then invest back into key areas such as infrastructure and technical skills and capacity? There's also things like looking at how we can perhaps work with some of the downstream buyers. But I think with the EV supply chain, it is very difficult to sort of look at that in the short term. It'll have to be sort of long-term approach to how Africa can really get involved in the supply chain for EVs. And I think where I see the gap is the fact that Africa's population will be in 30 years 2.6 billion. We will have a very growing youth population on the continent, and the technical skills that are required for electric vehicle manufacturing, etc., could be sourced from Africa if we start to make sure that we've got that capacity building happening now, and technical skills, etc. So for me, I think that is a clear area that Africa can definitely get involved in. Of course, when you think about processing and manufacturing, it's with a 15 to 20-year view. So I think that's the kind of role that we need to play now in terms of the policies that we develop to ensure that by 15 to 20 years, we are in the place where we can start to input meaningfully into the supply chain. Thank you.
Excellent. And I love the fact that you mentioned the need for us to start keeping these investors, especially based on the creative policies that we're creating. I've also noticed from my own independent research that most of these policies that we are pushing through to the market, I think sometimes don't really accommodate the private sector in general. I'm talking about things like, for instance, amending a country's mining code, for instance. There's been a lot of outcry around those changes to those particular pieces of legislation only favoring host countries. What is the level of private sector involvement you are seeing when developing these particular policies?
Is that to me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, thanks. I think, look, it's interesting you talk about the mining codes, because I think often that's where we end up having to do a lot of advisory work around it can often be prohibitive when mining codes are written. For example, there's a country that I know that's passed a mining code where it's stipulated that anyone looking to extract a critical mineral must process and manufacture as well. And it's very unlikely that you will find the likes of an Anglo-American, a BHP, changing their model overnight to become an extractor, a processor, and a manufacturer. And so the mining codes that countries that develop really need to speak to the kind of investors that they're looking to bring in, and also make it attractive. And you cannot make it attractive if you're making it so difficult for those companies to come in. So for me, it's around how can you perhaps look at incentives? How can you draft mining codes that attract both the extractor and the processor and the manufacturer in separate ways, and not just doing a catch-all, because ultimately what that will do is just deter the investor from coming into the country. So investors are very interested in how these are being drafted, and they're very aware of when legislation is passed. We get asked all the time, how things are developing, but ultimately it's in that, how you shape that mining code, how you shape your legislation is who you're going to attract or detract, if that's even a word. But yeah, I think that's key to attracting investors into the space.
I agree with you. And coming to you, Roshan, obviously I do see a lot of targets around different deliverables. We have to hit this by 2030. We have to do this by 2040, which I think gives me a sense that our speed to market, especially with regards to deploying these technologies, should be done at a faster rate. I know for a fact that your company, Stardust Power Inc., has done quite a lot of work within a very short period of time. What is it that you are doing differently to ensure that you are deploying these technologies to the market at a faster rate compared to what we've been seeing in the market?
Yeah, that's a great question. At Stardust Power, our mantra has often been speed to market, but without sacrificing safety and, reducing risk. So we've been really pushing our project down pushing it forward. And one of the ways we're doing that is by investing into the project as a sponsor ourselves. We've been investing into site due diligence, land acquisition, and most importantly, perhaps engineering, so that we can de-risk our project to increase the overall timeline. One of the ways that we've been effective is by our plan from day one and continually executing that business plan without changing a lot. A lot of people shift to different materials as the market changes, but we've been really focused on our lithium processing play through all market conditions, and we've been able to move forward. When we talk about other milestones to moving forward, permitting is a very big one. And we've been very successful in our permitting. We are currently fully permitted to start major construction with our stormwater and general construction permit. But also there is limited permitting requirements on us because we are so sustainable and efficient as we are engineered. For example, we're using zero liquid discharge technology coupled with a closed loop water system. So we're recycling our water and not creating liquid discharge. And we've been informed by the Oklahoma Regulatory Agency, the Oklahoma Department of Environmental Quality, that we do not even need a water permit, which is, really exciting, speaking to the sustainable nature. Also, it's been shown that we only need a minor air permit instead of a major air permit. Our production lines are engineered as predominantly electric. I believe we only have a couple of natural gas boilers that are producing those air emissions. So we're able to move forward very quickly. So, our strategy is to continue de-risking the project as we move to FID, and all of our attention is on that.
That's interesting to hear. And one of the risks that I foresee, I know obviously you've been so upfront in terms of just thinking through the project. Human capital for me, I think, is a very big issue. Personally, seeing that I work in this particular space, I know it's very difficult for us to get, for instance, labor from a different sector, plug and play into the critical mineral space. How are you foreseeing the human capital risk playing out, and how are you addressing that?
Yeah, workforce development is a major topic that often goes overlooked, but that is something we've been focused on. So first, even with our site selection, we think Oklahoma has a lot of advantages. Oklahoma is building out a critical materials corridor with nickel processing, for example, other lithium recycling. So Oklahoma is making a concentrated effort to build that economy of the next generation. Also, Oklahoma is blessed with a lot of skilled oil and gas engineers. And while you mentioned it's difficult to take from outside industries, our process of lithium brine refining has a lot of parallels to the oil and gas engineering refining space. So we see an opportunity to cross-train many of that workforce. And also, we've been working with the local community, the state, and the region on training that workforce of tomorrow. We work locally in schools in Muskogee, including trade schools, universities, even down to secondary schools, helping evolve curriculum that could be useful in training that next generation. We're working with Ohio University on extracting and refining technologies, which improves our technology stack, but also gives us a pipeline of future workers in that area. So, the hundreds of high-paying jobs we will create must need to be filled, and we've been thoughtful even before we need to hire those. So, we think an advantage of the region is in America in general is high levels of workforce, and we're excited to be hiring for those jobs.
Brilliant. Good to hear that. And coming to you, Veronica, you briefly touched on this. So the role that Africa is currently playing, I think, cannot be overemphasized. There's a lot that's happening, especially with regards to just supporting the development of critical mineral supply chains. And I know quite recently we had our past US president obviously visiting Angola. There's been a lot of talk around facilitating as well as deploying the Lobito rail, just to make sure that these minerals are moving effortlessly from Congo, Zambia through to Angola. So thinking about all these things, it's very clear that the strategic position of Africa is slowly shifting. From your perspective, how do you see Africa fitting into this whole entire supply chain equation? Should we be thinking about localizing manufacturing, localizing processing, and many other things?
Good question, and yeah, you've given me 5 minutes to make to answer this one. It's more like a 3-year response, but let me start by saying, look, I think this space of critical minerals is going to be a game changer for the continent if it's harnessed correctly. So it's all the things that I mentioned earlier. We need to make sure we have sound policy. We have a great, we've got access to energy. We've got good infrastructure. We have access to water. So those are the fundamentals. But I perhaps be a bit controversial by saying, perhaps it's not around adding value to the electric vehicle supply chain. I think Africa in itself is one of the biggest markets in the world and a trading bloc. And so for me, I see the excitement in how do we develop markets within the continent. As I mentioned earlier, the biggest electric vehicle markets right now exist in China and in the US. China makes electric vehicle batteries, at a very low cost. And so for Africa to compete in a meaningful way, it's going to take some doing, particularly when you think about the fact that on the continent, we are not going to have, huge uptake of electric vehicles purely because price is prohibitive, and those things I mentioned earlier. We have lack of energy, our infrastructure and it still needs work, and the access to water. So all that being said, it's how do we develop markets within the continent for us to trade more effectively and create markets that then attract investors in. And for me, I see a lot of opportunity in the downstream space. It's the petrochemicals, it's the fertilizers. I see a lot of opportunity there for the continent. I think whilst electric vehicle supply chain is definitely an area that is growing, and Africa can certainly support in terms of the lithium, copper, cobalt, nickel that it possesses. I potentially would say that, we would maybe look at using that in terms of developing sovereign wealth funds, as I say, investing back into our own infrastructure, investing into those technical skills, whilst also building markets within the continent for us to trade more effectively and building some of those industries that I mentioned on the downstream side. Just sort of in the short to medium term, that's kind of where I would focus, with a view to then in the 30 years, will we be still looking at electric vehicles in the same way? Possibly not. We may have economic growth happening in that time, therefore more money in people's pockets, more money to purchase. And so purchasing power, I think, is very linked into how this space can develop. If we can ensure that individuals on the continent are able to afford power, are able to afford electric vehicles, then there'll be a complete shift in what kind of focus we will need to place on critical minerals. But for now, it's just trying to enter the market, trying to enter the supply chain. I see a few ways that we can do that in a meaningful way in the short to medium term. So yeah, that's where I would say that I think, Africa would play a role.
Yeah, that's very true. And speaking of obviously localizing most of these processes, I think for me that's what is going to drive the required demand that we are sort of like chasing. And coming to you, Roshan, I know for a fact that just developing critical minerals requires a lot of technology, and the technology that you guys are deploying, I think, seems to be first of its kind, which for me presents quite a lot of technological risk, if I can use that term. How are you preparing for that? And are there any timelines that you would want to share with us in terms of just from the time you got your permitting up to the time you're thinking of going into full production?
Yeah, that was for me, right, Jacob? Yeah. So, our strategy has kind of been somewhat different, where we're not taking a lot of technology risk. We're using proven, established, off-the-shelf technology. Of course, we resize each circuit in our layout and plan, but we're very limited on technological risk, using all proven and established tech, using quality vendors. So we're not deploying a bunch of proprietary technology, which we think increases our timeline to market and decreases the risk for potential investors. So, when we think about that in conjunction with permitting, that's another example of how we've been de-risking the project, is securing the permitting we need well in advance of the project. As mentioned earlier, we are fully permitted to start major construction, and we are almost fully permitted to commence operations. Our air permit has been administratively approved, and we look forward to good news on that, and that will be substantially complete in the permitting process. So as I mentioned earlier, our mantra is speed to market, but by limiting risk. So we're really not absorbing that technology risk. Now, at the same time, we're improving our technology stack. We've did an exclusive license with KMX technology on concentration. So we can concentrate upstream feedstock to effectively removing the water and sending to our central refinery to improve logistics. And we built in the infrastructure for repulping, blending to create a consistent feedstock. As I mentioned, we're working with groups like Ohio University to improve those, technological facets as we move forward. But really, our strategy has been to limit technology risk.
Excellent. And just in concluding, I wanted to pose this question to you, Veronica. I have a lot of interests in what's happening in Africa in general. And looking through what the Critical Minerals Africa group is doing, I think it's a lot of work. I also do feel that a lot of synergies, a lot of partnerships need to happen between the private and the public sector. Is there anything you would want to share, just high level, in terms of how these two different camps can work together and drive the critical minerals agenda?
Yeah, thank you. And great question. I think for me, it's just about convening more dialogue. I think we can't put meaningful policy or regulation or incentives together without first understanding what the hindrances, what the challenges and barriers are for investors. I think there's some really interesting ways that both the governments and the private sector can work together. We've seen how effective the likes of PPPs are in terms of infrastructure development, energy development. I'd like to see that same approach adopted for critical minerals or strategic minerals, just to coin a different phrase, because I think that's something that's really important for us to get right as well, is what is critical for Africa. And I don't think we've established that critical minerals essentially are the minerals that we are currently seeing used for the EV market. I've mentioned them earlier: lithium, copper, cobalt, nickel. However, are those the minerals that Africa wants to see on their own critical minerals list? Each country should develop their own based on their requirements, based on their needs. So that's important. That kind of dialogue with private sector will help understand, market need, market requirement, and therefore what kind of minerals you need to place focus on. I also think that there are other ways that private sector and public sector can work more closely together with regards, shaping regulation, particularly around ESG. I know our friends in Europe are very keen on ensuring that, we are meeting ESG requirements on the continent, particularly when it comes to mining, and rightly so. However, sometimes it can be a bit of a hindrance in terms of if Africa is seeking a partner, if they've got to work with a partner that wants to have, A to Z ticked off on the list, as opposed to another partner that just likes to get the job done and get on with it. Who are they going to go for? So it's about how do we create dialogue to ensure that we are creating frameworks and policies that are useful and help implement partnerships rather than deterring them. So that's another area. And I think on finance, I think that's also really vital. If you're looking to finance mining operations, again, we need to be very clear about, the government stance, how much government buy-in will be involved, i.e. what are the risks, what are the guarantees that governments can offer. I think that helps then crowd in other investors, from the DFIs to the private equities, etc. So there's a few ways I think that I see important dialogue needing to happen between private sector and government, and both help the other. And a few tools and approaches such as PPPs, I think we could start to see more of developing on the continent. But dialogue is vital for this sector for this space, to really move forward in a meaningful way.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And lastly, for you, Roshan, I did receive a specific question for you. There's been a lot of interest around the FAIL 3 report. So the question that I got was, are you able to just share a brief summary in terms of what has changed from the FAIL 2 report to the 3, and what does that really do, or what does it mean for Stardust Power Inc. in general?
Yeah, I think we'll be happy to continually release more details on the FEL3 report. The next step for us is, with my background as investor to continue to de-risk the project, is we're doing an independent engineering study currently. So Primera USA, a leading EPC in this space, completed our FEL3 report, substantial, a lot of resources put into that. And we're taking the extra step of having an independent engineer review those, and so we can also present those independent findings to investors. So as that process completes, I'd be happy to share more details with you. And Jacob, always happy to share, but we're really focused on de-risking the project. As an investor, I like to look at things through an investor perspective. So that's kind of where we're at. We were extra conservative in earlier iterations, as from the starting point. But as we've been able to define our engineering and our scope, we've been very successful in driving costs down, and efficiency is at the core of our process. So look forward to sharing more details with you, Jacob.
Roshan, Veronica, thank you so much. I really do appreciate your time. It's been nice having this conversation with you.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
I appreciate you. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.